All right, everyone, welcome back. This is going to be lecture 6. This is chapter 10 from the book. We're going to be covering democracies, democratic transitions, theories about transitions. I'm going to kind of take us in whole different directions. So I hope you like it. You will find the slide packet in there. And so I hope you like that too. All right, so basically, democracy has not really touched the Middle East much. There are, Iran is sort of a pseudo democracy, but I don't think anyone classifies it as one. Jordan, possibly. Turkey probably would classify. But there's not a whole lot of actual democracy in the region. Um, and there are quite a few reasons for this, and we'll talk about this in this lecture, but I'm really going to hit it hard in the next lecture. So in slide 1, we can see what we call in political science the waves of democracy by Samuel Huntington. His famous book came out in 1991, and it talks about different sort of the periodicity of democratization over time. And so you can see the first wave really is starting, with the American Revolution, with the French Revolution, things like this. You start to see some growth in democracy over time, especially in places like Europe, all the way up until basically the World War II period, right, where fascism is rising, Nazism is rising, dictatorship is rising as a phenomenon in general, as people are sort of willing to give up their rights because of all the madness going on in their sort of everyday lives and in the economy, etc. We see a massive drop off during the World War II period, and we go from a peak of 33 democracies to 11, right? And then we get the second wave starting around the mid 1950s as we're really ramping up the Cold War against the Soviet Union. America is, for the most part, pushing democratic governance. That wasn't always the case, especially if you look at places like Guatemala or Nicaragua, especially a lot of sort of South American democracies that were going to be led by communist or leftist regimes. Suddenly, America wasn't all that interested in democracy anymore. But for the most part, we could see democracy rising during sort of the second wave. That's during sort of the post-war period, right? And then we move into the sort of decolonization period, and we see another dip. A lot of states end up being autocracies, especially in Africa, and then many in Asia. You start to see the third wave of democracy rising in the mid 1970s. And then, it really peaks probably in the 2010s, and we are now in another reversal period, right? And this is a lot of sort of the hopeful stuff that Fukuyama from Stanford was writing about, Huntington in 1991, though he definitely turned his tone when he wrote Clash of Civilizations. But, at no point at all was the Middle East really involved all that much with turns toward democratization. Even post Arab Spring, we didn't really see that. We just saw either a cracking down or we saw, what we call competitive authoritarianism, where they have like elections, but they're not actually free and fair, these sorts of things, right? Okay. I would also say that Zavorsky and Lamonji, who we'll talk about here in a little while, some of their research, they were very famous for sort of teasing out whether modernization theory was right or not, which we'll talk on. But they also really provided strong evidence for the fact that you really need a middle class to see a transition into democracy. And usually that means a couple of things. It means your economy is diversified. It means the state is getting pressure from more than just one direction. And it means that the population is in general clamoring for more sort of self-governance, right? Okay. We will move on to slide 3. This is the state of democracy globally. And this comes from Statista. I think this might be Freedom House data. I should have done a little bit more research here, but this just gives you sort of a nice picture of what the globe looks like. You can see that in general, the Scandinavian countries tend to be leading in a lot of these international comparisons, not only on democracy, but with like, I don't know, healthcare and equality, lack of inequality in the economy, these sorts of things. Very strong democracies. Then you see sort of the middling. You got Canada, Australia, much of Europe. The United States is sort of in the flawed democracies territory and getting worse from what it seems. You've got the hybrid regimes, which we'd probably call sort of competitive authoritarianism, or what we used to hopefully refer to as transition states, but a lot of them just never actually transitioned. They've been stuck in this middle territory for a long time. And that includes some African countries and it includes Mexico. And then finally, the dark red and these pink states are generally dictatorships, authoritarianism, military juntas, petro-states, etc. Right? Okay. The next slide is just a zoom in of the Middle East, and so you can see here that I think that's Israel counts as a democracy, though they are also seeing some slippage with sort of the rise of the far right over there and some attempts to sort of, I don't know, castrate the judicial system and these sorts of things. But you could see that for the most part, other outside of sort of Tunisia and maybe Israel, a lot of these states aren't really, democracies in any sense. Many of them aren't even really trying to be democracies, right? They're not even sort of sending those signals of competitive authoritarianism. They're just outright monarchies or petrostates, etc. Okay. The next slide. All right, the author talks about three main ways that we can transition toward democracy, right? And the first they suggest is sort of civil society from below. This would maybe be the US Revolution, the French Revolution, the post Soviet states, right, where they all had to sort of come to agreements and piece together new nations. And then maybe arguably even sort of the Lenin Trotsky revolution in Russia in the early 20th century. Then we've got transitions from above, and this generally tends to be military dictatorships or juntas that eventually hand governance back to a civilian government and sort of return to the barracks, as they like to call it. We saw a lot of this in Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s, including Brazil, Uruguay, and others. Turkey sort of went through this experience, though they had a lot of military coups, but they're finally sort of on the right track. The problem with this sort of transition from above is that a lot of these leaders and the military leaders who ran the country and sort of instituted really bloody repression, the only, they would not transition toward democracy and civilian control until they were promised constitutionally guarantees that they would not be prosecuted for war crimes, human rights violations, torture, mass graves, and oftentimes, including like Colombia and the FARC, they're even promised positions in the legislature moving forward. And so, like, I get it, we're trying to stop a civil war, we're trying to return to democracy, but man, some of that shit is really troubling. And there has been some disgusting and atrocious human rights violations that happen in some of these states like Turkey, South America, etc. Okay, and then the third, right? We had civil society from below, we have transition from above, and then we have sort of this gradual loosening for, I don't know, like elite sectoral leaders or these sorts of things, right? And so they tend to be powerful industry leaders or political leaders, and the state is sort of under assault a little bit, right? The state is maybe collapsing or struggling, or trying to re-solidify power, or maybe there's a high inflation and like the Arab Spring, that kind of thing. Um, and some examples of this, and they generally tend to use the state's own rules, right? So even dictatorships and competitive authoritarian states and things of this sort tend to have constitutions or rules or these sorts of things, right? Even if leaders tend to break them. Um, and so some of these smart groups who will wrest a little bit more control from a dictatorship will use those actual rules against them, right? And I've got some examples here. I think this would probably include the British, right? Like they did have the English Civil War and all this kind of stuff, but it took them a very long time, centuries probably, to really develop the strength of the parliament over the monarchy and these sorts of things, right? Mexico was like a century-long project, and some like Jaworski, who we'll talk about in a minute, don't actually count them as a democracy for a very long time because the PRI was the only party in power for about 70 years. Same with sort of the LDP in Japan and others. But this was sort of a gradual loosening, right? And now the Moreno party, who came out of sort of nowhere with Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, who was the last president, and now Moreno's Claudia Sheinbaum. They have, we have seen transitions, and I think we can call it democratic. The problem is it functional, right? Okay. And then much of the West has sort of taken in this gradual loosening program, right? Um, let's see. Yeah, usually this tends to mean you have a declining dictator or a declining state apparatus or military junta. This can be from a number of reasons, like we talked about. Maybe you're having economic problems. Maybe your leader just died and there's no one to sort of take control, so there's space. Um, let's see, maybe there was sort of national embarrassment like we saw with, Gamal Abdel Nasser, etc. Maybe inflation, right, and joblessness, which was the much of what led to the Arab Spring. Okay, so this leads us to Jaworski and Lamonji from 1997, and then their very famous book in 2000. They suggest that, like, much of the literature up until this time just sort of assumed modernization theory, right? We're moving from, I don't know, agricultural through industrial to post industrial and then to knowledge economy. And this is just how it works and it's linear and everybody does it this way, right? And then also, like that linear and increasing wealth, especially in the sense of building a middle class, eventually always leads to democracy, right? But Jaworski and Lamonji are like, no, it's not really how it works, right? You've got an endogeneity problem here where it's not actually causative, right? It's just sort of correlative. And so they suggest it's not about modernization and becoming wealthy. They suggest that poor states under what at that time in I guess their data set was up to like $1985. And so it's basically like if you were below a GDP per capita of $7,000 or whatever in their index at the time of publication, um, your society is very likely to just have random transitions, right? Autocratic collapses, maybe democratic rises, maybe new autocracies. Who really knows, right? And what happens is, as you're becoming wealthier and you surpass that sort of $7,000 mark at the time, that's where you develop stability as a regime. And so, if you are a democracy at the point in time where you pass $7,000 in per capita GDP, you don't have to worry about a transition back towards autocracy. And so democratic states with high GDPs at that time remain democratic states. On the flip side, however, it also solidifies autocracies, right? This hopeful notion that China was somehow going to become overturned because they were let into the World Trade Organization, and we're seeing rising incomes in China and all this. That absolutely did not turn into democracy, right? It may have even helped them further their authoritarian project. And you see the same in all of these rentier states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc. Right, and so modernization can be troubling because autocracies who surpass that level also become sort of ossified and stuck in the amber like Jurassic Park, right? There is no changing them into democracies for the most part at that point. All right, that's enough of that. Let's see. Slide 7. Okay. The author talks a lot about civil society organizations as the reason for democratic transitions, and I have to push back a little bit. This was actually sort of what I wrote my dissertation about: civil society organizations and trust in government, and sort of gaps in trust between majority and minority ethnic, religious, etc. groups, right? And so, first, the leading sort of scholar in this field of civil society organizations is Robert Putnam from Harvard. I think he was an Amish guy, if I remember my history right, who got into science and now is like, dude, that guy has published high level research in like every strand of economics, political science. He's a remarkably brilliant man. I have some issues with his methodologies, but whatever, I'll leave that alone. All right, so if you want to know more about civil society organizations, check out first Making Democracy Work, which was his sort of, I think, 6 month or year long project in Italy, where he compared northern Italy, industrial sort of area, versus southern Italy, more agricultural and like mafia based, and how that lended itself to government functionality and efficacy, right? And then his second book was called Bowling Alone from 2000, and it's about sort of the dearth of civil society organizations in America, like book clubs and bowling organizations, and how that is causing increasing distance between citizens and greater strength for sort of government and greater polarization and all of these kind of stuff. Fascinating stuff. But basically, the reason that the author is talking about, the author from the book we're reading, was talking about civil society organizations as being important in transitioning toward democracy, especially when you have this sort of lower level democracy. Is first, I shouldn't say lower level democracy, I mean democracy coming from the bottom or civil society organizations. Folk heroes, right, can become very important, right? They may start an organization, or they may represent sort of a chunk of the population or something like that, right? And they become rising and powerful. And the temptation is often for dictators to either kill them, co opt them, or denounce them. Um, but two of those projects, martyrdom and denouncement or denunciation, can lead to real problems, right? You can actually create a folk hero who becomes a symbol around which to rally, right? And so that's why I've got Ali Khamenei here. He was in exile for years, but somehow he ended up representing sort of uh, the Islamists and the religious portions of Iran. And when Reza II fled to the US to become an Air Force pilot or something, then Khamenei stepped in and he's like this national hero, right? All right, the next page, let's see, that was Khamenei, is agglomeration. And, if we think about, those of you who took my last class on public policy, we talk about sort of how these organizations come up from the ground because they find like-minded groups or like-minded individuals, and then there are there are benefits, right, of agglomerating your interests, right? You can have certain people you can distribute people to particular expertise domains rather than trying to focus on everything about a problem all at once. You can share information. There's all this kind of stuff, right? I would say, however, that many in the civil society organization literature and research are very rosy about this kind of stuff, right? Because there's a much darker side of these civil organizations in that they also lead to terrorism, hate groups, racial supremacy groups. So if you think about just in the Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Al Qaeda came out of there. But, this is not only in the East, right, or in the Middle East. This is also in the West, right? So this includes organizations like the KKK and their violence against Black people in the South during Jim Crow, and they seem to be rising again. This includes sort of the violence of the Jacobins under the French. And so, like, yes, they can provide social goods and a space to communicate your ideas, but they can also sort of promote hate, racial supremacy, violence, terrorism, etc. And many of these groups have learned to wrap this sort of hateful rhetoric and disdain for others in the community around sort of social goods for our members, right? So this was sort of the basis for National Socialism, right? Nazism. We are going to share and share alike for those who are worthy of it. In a sense, this is what Hamas is. Yes, they do provide some schooling and food programs and things like this, but in many ways, it's just a cover up for their violent actions. And so here you can see the KKK having a wonderful day out at the fair. And, this is the kind of troubling stuff that needs to be thought about when we talk about civil society organizations. They don't always lead to democracy and friendly, rosy governance, right? So be skeptical about this kind of stuff. All right. The next slide, transitions, calculus, and the minimum winning coalition. I think this is important in understanding how the Middle East operates, in understanding how dictatorships operate, right? This comes from a group of researchers named Bueni de Mesquita from NYU, Morrow, Smith, and Syverson. Their famous article came out in 2003, and they've expanded on it since. And it is sort of known colloquially within economics and political science as the BDM squared S squared article, right? Because Mosquito, Morrow, Smith, Syverson, BDM squared S squared. And their basic theory is wrapped around the idea that leaders want to keep their position, and and that what you need as a leader is to build what's called a minimum winning coalition. And these minimum winning coalitions look very different in different governances, right? And so you have three levels of this theory. You have the residents of your nation or the population or whatever you might want to call it. Second, you've got the selectorate. So in democracies, this is usually registered voters or the people who vote in each election. And then you have your winning coalition, right? So the number of votes you actually need to win an election. But the selectorate in autocracies and dictatorships tends to be very small, right? Elites, industry leaders, military leaders, maybe the leaders of some of your bureaucratic institutions, and the sort of hyper wealthy in your economy. And the minimum winning coalition is even smaller, right? This is just the number of people or the percentage of your basically your selectorate that needs to be kept happy to keep power, right? And so in democracy, this means you got to win an election. And we won't even get into gerrymandering house elections and stuff, but theoretically, you got to win an election and a free and fair election, and so you need to sort of win 50% plus one if you're in a two-party system. In an autocracy, you don't have to worry about that. All you have to do is keep a very small group of people happy and keep that group as small as possible to keep your position so that you don't have to dole out as many goods, right? All right, so that's the basic theory. What are the implications? Number one, democracies provide public goods. Autocracies provide private goods, right? And we can even see this on sort of a scale, right? Even democracies that are worse democracies tend to have fewer public goods, like the United States, versus those that tend to be the best graded democracies, like Finland, Sweden, whatever, tend to have the highest public goods, right? But then once you slip into sort of competitive authoritarianism, or even just outright dictatorship. Public goods are, leaders are disinterested in public goods. They don't give a shit about keeping 50% of the people happy, right? They don't need to. It's not of their concern because those people don't keep them in power. So autocracies only have to win their minimum winning coalition, which looks very different from the one in a democracy. And so you don't dole out goods. Number two, you get very unstable leadership. Yeah, instability outside of the particular leader, right? So charismatic leadership, I don't know, this sort of cult of personality leadership, which tends to be on the rise, military dictatorship, etc. You see, first of all, incredible high instability, right? Because the idea of the minimum winning coalition, the word minimum is very key, right? You want to keep your group as small as possible. That keeps you in power. That way you can sort of minimize how many payment, how much payout you have to make, right? And so if you just keep rotating leadership, as do places like Putin, um, and some of these sort of leaders in the Middle East, right? Or they keep it all in the family and it's very nepotistic, these sorts of things, they'll rotate people in and out so they can't gain experience, so they can't gain an audience, so they can't sort of figure out the ins and outs to provide a challenge, all of these sorts of ideas, right? And so recently you actually saw Putin kill his general, the general that sort of turned around, I think it was like 2 years ago, started to march towards the capital, and then stopped, and then within weeks he's dead in a plane crash, like that kind of shit. So, yeah, these dictatorships in many ways are constantly ensuring that no one can challenge their rule, right? Third, this means you get a fight to the death by the elites, right? The big struggle in creating a democracy is wresting power from the elites in your society, the political and the institutional and the economic elites in your society, right? And the problem here is that it's this public versus private good. The public wants public goods, right? They don't want to be ignored or unemployed or whatever it is, right? They don't want these handouts just being given to their corporatist cronies or the political elites in their society. But the political elites do want that, right? If you if you're running, I don't know, the military under Xi or Putin or Mohammed bin Salman, you're living large, right? You're living large and you're living wildly different from your average citizen. And so they will hold on to that power as much as they can. And this is often why you'll see violence before a state will give up any kind of democratic control, right? It also means that you will see high levels of co-optation of dissident leaders, right? And so not only do you get high levels of turnover and spinning through institutions and these sorts of things, you also get the payouts to keep those who are important in your minimum winning coalition happy. Um, but if someone does start to rise, a lot of times the first instinct is to just buy them out, right? and try and co-opt that potential rising leader, right? And then if that doesn't work, we'll kill him or jail him or disappear him or her or whatever. But co-optation tends to be a pretty high strategy. Okay, and then finally, new institutions are hard as hell to build and to build fairly, not only because of all the reasons we just talked about and the power vacuum that is created, but also because of all of the propaganda that's been happening for years, convincing citizens that this is the right approach. Um, because there's oftentimes very little civil society organization. There's no real history of democracy or practice or voting or whatever. So it is not easy to transition to a democracy. All right, we got one more here. Why not democracy in the Middle East? And the author, and too many authors, in my opinion, make the argument for the grand bargain in the Middle East, which I think is a bit of bullshit. The idea here is that the state provides income and jobs and stability or whatever. And so the argument to be made is that the citizens sort of agree in some sense not to be a rabble rouser, um, because the state is paying. And we have talked about this before. And it does increase the costs of trying to speak out against your state from an economic perspective, right? But there are problems with this argument. First, it seems like propaganda for these states, right? A bargain sounds way different from repression or oppression, which is probably closer to the truth, right? So it's whitewashing, in a sense, some of these states' behaviors and saying, oh, well, the citizens just made a bargain to do this because, they're being provided. That's not true. Second, how do we test this argument? There's no way. I'm struggling to come up with a way to test this argument theoretically or with data or observationally. It seems just like a supposition and not a scientific endeavor, right? Which also frustrates the hell out of me. Third, as I kind of mentioned, a grand bargain and mass repression are two very different arguments, right? Citizens never signed a contract that they don't want free speech and free association and like freedom of media and all of these things. Um, they're jailed if they speak out, or they're killed, or they're made an example of, right? That's not a contract. And also, this idea that the state cares for its citizens is also bullshit in some senses, right? Like, why did the kid sit down in the middle of the street and light himself on fire if the state was taking care of him, right? Like, this was the predecessor to the Arab Spring. Self-immolation doesn't sound like part of the contract, honestly, right? There are massive gaps in some of these societies about whether they want either, I don't know, theocracy, say in Iran, or military dictatorship, say in Egypt, or petrostate, say in Oman or in Saudi Arabia. And many of them want to be Western. They want free media. They want free association. They want free speech. And so, this is a very hard sort of argument for me to swallow. I'll be honest with you. There is also no bargain to be had in mass military expenditures to repress your citizens, vast repression of media and speech, and all of this. The giant surveillance state. I mean, it just sounds disingenuous to me. My answer is far more related to the resource curse, right, and the disconnect between citizen accountability, or excuse me, accountability to the citizen by the state, right? All right, I'm going to leave it there. A couple of different arguments that I was frustrated with, but I actually find that fun. Um, Nobody's right about everything, and every single piece of anything that I ever read, I am always questioning what are they trying to say here, right? So I promote you doing the same as well. All right, thanks for being here. I'll get the next one up tomorrow. Have a great day.